um, the cognitive side of sports. And it's going to be a very exciting seminar because Mark Williams is a researcher who's now at University of Utah, and I'll let him introduce himself in a second. But Mark has really seen sports training from all aspects, not just baseball and softball, but he's worked in cricket, he's worked in soccer, or called football in the UK, and he's worked in many other sports. And this book that we're going to be talking about today, The Best, How Elite Athletes Are Made, is really going to be a survey on various aspects that have to do with training. And so I'm going to put a link in the chat right now so everyone can see that on the right side of their screen. If they hit the chat button at the bottom, they'll be able to see the link. That's a link to the Amazon page for the book, so you can take a closer look either now in the seminar or later. But anybody we are running a little promotion where anybody who gets the book during the seminar and can, send us a receipt of that, you'll get a free month of the customized training that we do with uHIT. So be sure to check out the book at least. I think you're going to get a lot out of today, getting a good preview of the book. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Professor Williams so that he can tell you a little bit about where he's coming from, his background, and also tell you a little bit about the book in terms of it's kind of an overview. And we'll be starting from there in terms of talking about how elite athletes are made and the research behind that Professor Williams has found in his years of work. So, Mark, I'll turn it over to you.
Okay, thanks very much, Jason. Thanks for the opportunity to come and be part of this podcast, whatever you might call it. And thanks to everybody for tuning in. As Jason said, my background is mostly in sport and exercise science, although my PhD was actually in cognitive science. So I'm particularly interested in expertise and skill learning across domains. And whilst I've actually published a lot of academic books in the past, actually published 18 previous books, this is my first attempt at a popular science book. And as Jason said, the book, The Best, How Elite Athletes Are Made, was actually written with a journalist, Tim Wigmore, who works for the Daily Telegraph. And in essence, there are three parts to the book. In the first part, we talk about the role of luck and serendipity in the development of expertise. So there are chapters in the book that focus on issues like the importance of family and siblings in the development of elite athletes, where you're born, when you're born relative to the selection year, the importance of street sport, and whether there are any early predictors of talent. And I guess the section highlights that no matter what your genetic background, there is still a fair element of luck involved in becoming an elite athlete. But of course, it's not all about luck. So in part 2 of the book, we talk about some of the adaptations that occur through prolonged engagement in the sport, with a particular focus on some of the psychological issues. So there are topics in there, like, for instance, the development of game intelligence skills, like anticipation and decision-making, deception and disguise, and some of the psychological characteristics that underpin expert performance. So characteristics like grit, resilience, mental toughness, coping with anxiety, and obviously avoiding the pressures of choking. And how do we do that? And what are some of those key adaptations that are crucial to the development of expertise? And then in the final section of the book, the shift is more towards environment and coaching. So there's a chapter in it on deliberate practice and how that might work, and coaching and the importance of more hands-off rather than hands-on approach to the coaching process, and how the general philosophy underpinning coaching has evolved over the last couple of decades. And then the final chapter focuses on technology some of the new things on the horizon that may impact the development of elite athletes moving forward. So the tome, there's a lot of science in it, but having said that, because of Tim's involvement, it's actually written in a pretty digestible manner. So we've actually got interviews from maybe between 50 and 100 of some of the best athletes in the world, including Joey Votto, Steph Curry, Pete Sampras, and so on and so forth. So it was an interesting journey, really, in terms of the development of the book. And maybe if Jason asks a question on that later, we can talk a little bit more about that. But that's the synopsis of the book in terms of the topics that it covers.
No, that's great. I think having those kind of three parts to it in mind is helpful because, as I started looking through the book, I remember, like you said, this kind of more accessible way it's written because of Tim's involvement, I think is incredibly crucial. When we were approached by the author of the Performance Cortex before he even had an idea to write an article, let alone a book about what we were doing, we kind of, screened him, so to speak, to see, like, does he have the writing capability to explain topics that are not so easily explainable or translatable from the scientific discourse, right? And from the samples that I've read of, and we were, obviously very happy with the result because Zach did a great job in that. And as I was reading The Best, How Elite Athletes Are Made, I was seeing that come across as well too, that they were, not easy topics to explain, but they were being explained in the language. And I think this is a difference from what you and Tim did with this book, which is the interview aspect. I mean, it's really impressive having interviews there with, Joey Votto, Steph Curry. There are some elite, soccer players, otherwise, interviews in there, and it's in their language. And then when in the interview, right? And then I've noticed like that you're able to connect it to the science side of things. I mean, I'm specifically talking about the section with Joey Votto because that's how we got kind of, aware of this book in the first place. When Mark asked me, I don't know how long ago it was, maybe a couple of years, about, our work, meaning me and my first research partner and now partner on uHIT to servo everything we do, about our research about how the brain works when baseball hitters are deciding on pitches and what's going on a brain level, like actual physical parts of the brain, what's involved in those milliseconds. And in Mark's book, they have this section, I think it's called like how to hit a ball in 0.5 seconds. I'm paraphrasing it, but in that section, it's this interview between Joey Votto about what he does with his approach and how his approach has evolved from when he was pre-professional, and then when he started getting the professional ball, the changes he noticed he had to make. And we're going to take a dive into some of that, I think, in a second to illustrate not just, how uHIT does what it does, but really how this book, it seems like, follows this really, I think, accessible and in the language of the athlete's template, whereby they're describing what their process is in their words. And then Mark is coming in and connecting it to the research side in a very insightful way, so that you can have a stepping point later. We actually have at least one professional player on the seminar today, who's a player we've worked with for several years now, back when we started with the Reds, the Cincinnati Reds organization in 2016. And I know this story, because it is Joey Votto also, will be, I think, relevant for him. That's Bruce Yari, who was on a uHIT Academy with us over the summer. I'm going to take a deep dive in right away, Mark, if you don't mind, on some of these passages from the Votto excerpt, because I think for the
Yeah.
baseball audience that's on right now, these are things that will, really help illustrate kind of not just, aspects about anticipation in baseball hitting or softball hitting, but how the book is formatted in general, in terms of the connection between, actual studies and these interviews. So
Yeah.
I'm going
Yeah.
to, jump in.
I should
Yeah,
just
go
very
ahead.
quickly before you do that and just
Yeah.
comment. Well, we actually worked the other way around in the sense that the way it worked on each chapter actually is I produced sort of 4,000 or 5,000 words of science notes, pulling in a summary of maybe 30 to 50 papers per chapter, and then Tim actually then superimposed the narrative around the science.
Right. No, and I
But
wanted to ask you about that,
yeah,
because I thought
yeah.
that's kind of, I think, the topic you were mentioning about, like, the process for how you guys did it, right?
Yeah. So we went back and forth on it, of course, in the sense that I'm with the respects, Tim didn't write it all. It was a joint effort, and actually, Tim also, with respects, actually came up with some science that I hadn't come across. So it became very much, a shared project. And whilst we had our creative tensions, so to speak, in the sense of my concerns about being true to the science and Tim's concerns about writing something in a style that was easily digestible, but I think we both very happy with the outcome. And in addition to the interviews with 50 to 100 odd athletes, we also interviewed probably a similar number of scientists,
Hmm.
which are also quoted, including yourself, which
Hmm.
are also quoted liberally throughout the book as well.
Yeah, no, and I think that's a very important point to make, is that mostly the science aspects had been done already, and you were starting from that point. And then um, Tim's involvement was, it sounds like, more was involved in getting the interviews with the athletes, which again is a very unique approach, I think, to a sports science book. From what I've seen, I mean, I know when Cortex came out, that had some aspects of it where the author tried to get some interviews with people we were working with, and there were all sorts of problems for, the teams in terms of confidentiality and that kind of stuff. It seems like in this particular, format of the book, it was thankfully general enough so that these athletes or, affiliated entities, whether it's a team or what, felt comfortable enough speaking with Tim in this context. And that's great, because I think the learning value is tremendous here, because it's in the words of the athletes themselves. And then your science research and literature review, either research you've done directly or literature research of other people's works, is the foundation really of that, and the interviews are really kind of like the color points. So with the Votto example, which I'll start with here, there are a few other topics I want to jump to, but I want to start with this one for everybody in the crowd, because this is most, I think, specific to baseball hitting. It's most specific to softball hitting. Joey Votto is one of those names in baseball, somebody who's known for being a student of his approach at the plate. This section that's called Second Nature, it's in the second section of the book, is really an account of that. So, he starts off by saying, I'm reading from the book here, that he could see the ball, react, and then hit the ball when it was around 75 or 80 miles per hour. And there are many players, we've met many of them, who approach their hitting this way, particularly at the high school level, the college level. Some of them push back on a tool like uHIT, or a tool like looking at their swings and blast, or whatever it is, because for them it's just instinctual. They see the ball, they react, they hit the ball. And they can do that when it's 75, 80 miles an hour. Just like Joey Votto says here. But Votto says that, in this section here, that when he started moving up towards 85, 90 miles per hour, at higher levels of play, his old method swiftly became inadequate, is the way it's described here. And he says, I was so late. And in Major League Baseball, you start getting into mid 90s, maybe even close to 100 in some cases. And really what's described here as the secret to Votto's success is that he learned to anticipate and read pitches to the degree that it became kind of second nature. He says it's second nature for him. And so he'd go into more detail here about what's his process, how does he anticipate? So he'll illustrate, for instance, here about like even before I take the at bat, the plan's already in my head, so it's less reactionary and just more executing the plan. So if I'm looking for a slider in that particular swing, so a type of swing, he's saying, and I get it, I better swing, right? So then he's illustrating here that, he's looking for a type of pitch is his approach up at the plate. And this is something that I think there are kind of two camps out there when it comes to hitting approach. And one of them focuses on these kind of tunnels. In this case, he's looking at a tunnel that involves where the slider pitch is going to be, and then what type of swing, in his words, a particular swing, he would put on the ball to meet it where it is. And then, the way he describes it here is that like, it's really about not being reactionary, but executing a plan. Because if you have to be reactionary and execute a plan, that makes it a little bit more difficult. And when you have, we'll get to it in a second, but when you have, milliseconds really to decide, you're making it more difficult for yourself. So he puts the focus on, do I execute the plan or do I not? And that's kind of what it seems like he talks about as his approach to anticipating and reading pitches. Can you talk maybe a little bit more about that from your perspective, Mark, and how you saw like this interview relate to some of the science that's discussed in this section here about gaze tracking and different parts of the brain and stuff like that?
Yeah, I mean, I guess there are different levels of information that are probably involved in this particular process. I mean, at the higher level of cognitive engagement, I guess, the batter will be making some a priori predictions about what might happen next. And those a priori predictions are going to be based on the context. So issues like, for instance, knowledge of that particular pitcher and his or her preferred tendencies. Issues like the positioning, how many in baseball, how many players are on base, the score in the game, how many innings are left, will all allow the batter to be able to formulate some initial prediction or expectation around what type of delivery is more or less likely in this particular situation. And then I guess what the batter does is he or she then looks to try and identify information in the environment then at a secondary level as the action unfolds. And there's now quite a lot of information across numerous different sports, tennis, cricket, soccer penalty kicks, a whole range of areas that suggest that experts are much better at picking up information from the postural orientation of the body shape of the opponent prior to ball release or football contact in the case of the soccer penalty. And that, they become very attuned to these sources of information, which again helps them prior to ball release make an initial prediction coupled with the initial expectational information as to what will happen next. It is possible also that the batter would pick up some information from the early portion of ball flight. But certainly when you're getting to ball speeds at around 90 plus miles per hour there, this notion that the batter actually watches the ball onto the bat is actually a myth per se, in the sense that the eyes aren't able to move quickly enough to follow a ball moving at that kind of velocity. So even though batters may feel that they're actually following the ball, that actually isn't the case. What they might do presumably is allow the ball to wash across the visual field, but they cannot actually move the eyes at a sufficient velocity to keep track with the movements of the ball. But I guess by and large, the key message here is that this is much more of an anticipatory skill than a reactive skill. And probably another key message also as well, actually, is that there's relatively little evidence to suggest that it's a visual skill per se. And yes, of course, vision is important, but it's more of a perceptual cognitive skill than it is a visual skill. So in other words, these are more perceptual cognitive skills than, for instance, this notion that the skilled batter has a much superior level of visual function per se. And whilst there's actually, this study hasn't been replicated in baseball, there's a very nice study in cricket where what they did is they had players move to strike cricket deliveries from bowlers, and they actually degraded vision just by putting tape over a pair of glasses that made vision more and more blurred. And even when they could literally just see the outline of the bowler, it was sufficient for them to actually pick up necessary information to be able to anticipate.
Mm-hmm. That kind of reminds me of the I wouldn't call it a study because it's with one very well known subject, but with Ronaldo, the soccer player, fielding corner kicks from in front of the goal at different intervals. The lights in the arena were shut down, so either like mid-flight, if this is the trajectory of the corner kick, the lights were hit here, and he was able to easily get in front of the ball and even kick it in. Then they were cut off a quarter of the way into the trajectory, and then right before the trajectory started, and then even before the kicker in the corner was 2 steps or so away from the ball. And progressively, as they turn off the lights further and further back, his error in terms of what parts of his body he has to position to get in front of the ball to put it in the goal increased, but he was still able to predict where his body, or what pieces of his body should be where in order to intercept the ball and get it into the goal, which kind of speaks to this anticipation piece from the batter themselves in terms of how they read the visual, the kinematics really of the pitcher in baseball or the bowler in cricket, just like Ronaldo is reading the corner kicker. And you know what, this is something that I think uHIT, we've had some various discussions with our players who use uHIT over the years, and it's a topic that I would like to dive a little bit more into, just to put everybody on the same page about what is uHIT, how does it work, that kind of stuff. I think it might be a good point just now to show everyone quickly kind of how it works, because this aspect of anticipating, really we can only look at from the perspective of what happens when you are looking at a ball flight. And so I'm just going to show everybody kind of like what happens when you go in the first time. Obviously we work on we customize uHIT to your particular hitting vision goals. And I know, Mark, on your point about that, it's not really a visual skill we're talking about here. It's a cognitive skill, right? It's this anticipation skill. We've run into the unfortunate situation that sports vision, whatever it is something that's kind of the pan term in the field. And so that's kind of something we work on. But, we have you select whether you're a righty or a lefty. And then you get to select, what your particular customized training is that, our automated Coach uHIT has you working on. And then when you go into the game itself, you are presented with, okay, what kind of pitches you'll see. I'll show you that again. What kind of pitches you'll see in a second. It'll switch to a left-handed pitcher. And after a little brief orientation of what you see on screen, you are looking at an avatar of a pitcher on the mound there who's going through a simulated windup and is, releasing the pitch. And then you have to, tap your screen for strikes and not tap for balls. But, with this you'll see the screen kind of move around a little bit as this VR kind of function you can do on your phone with uHIT. Here you're calling strikes just in this green part of the zone right here. If it's in this part of the zone, you're not going. So this is kind of like what Joey Votto is talking about when he's saying, like, I'm looking for a slider, right? I'm looking for, in this case, not sliders necessarily, but pitches that fit this tunnel, their tunnel would reach this plane in the front of the plate here. So that's kind of what's going on here. And you see this kind of simulated trajectory of a pitch where you had a windup of a pitcher, right? And then the pitch comes out. Now, the anticipation that has to happen here is that you have to predict as soon as possible from back here, right, what's going to happen the rest of the way up here on the pitch, right? And you have to predict what that endpoint is going to be, because that's going to determine for you whether this is a strike or not and whether you should be swinging at it or not. And so this is a topic that, we've thought a lot about with uHIT, because the avatar of what that pitcher does there in the windup and release, it changes a little bit for every pitch, because we have to modify the release point and stuff like that. But, generally, this is like the best pitcher you will ever face because he is keeping his mechanics almost exactly the same on every pitch. So you don't really have any anticipation info that you can look at in the same way that Votto was talking about in this passage. I remember he was talking about studying the catcher, what the catcher does before each pitch, what the pitcher does before his windup and even during his windup, to potentially give him a clue about each pitch. All of that information, really, in the case of uHIT, we've had to kind of simplify down for technical reasons, but also for training reasons, so that really you're starting to anticipate here, right? And you're continuing to anticipate as much as possible as that ball, goes by, so that you're not seeing the ball by the time it actually gets here, like what Mark's saying. And this is actually a passage described in the book very, very handily. You're not seeing it. Your eyes are not tracking the ball here necessarily. But what's going on is that because you tracked a little bit of the motion back here, right, you're able to then do an anticipation of what's going to be the rest of the way. And that's really what uHIT is aiming to do with its customized training, and what it's aiming to do with, using uHIT Plus on your own, really. And so that's something that I think, I think the terminology is still being worked out on that. It's kind of what our experience has been, Mark, where in the field, in sports, coaches, players themselves, anticipation versus sports vision, these are kind of, similar topics in the field. And I think what, has been incumbent upon us and, others in the field is to be able to try to highlight what these differences are in an educational capacity. And then also, give people the tools they can use without having to know necessarily how the engine works underneath, but so that they can get the results they want from using it. So our customized training has really prioritized making those kinds of underlying science aspects of anticipation and tuning your anticipation possible. And a reminder to everybody that the book, How Elite Athletes Are Made, we have the link in the chat right now. You can get it from that link. And if you get it while we're on the seminar here, you'll be able to get a free month of uHIT's customized training to be able to work on these types of, anticipation skills when it comes to different parts of the zone, different pitches, etc. It looks like we do have a question in the chat. We do have a couple other, interview questions I wanted to ask you, Mark, but I'm going to jump to one of the questions in the chat after you have a few words there. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah. I just want to make a couple of points, really.
Please.
Based on the image that you put forward there. And firstly, and this is still from a science perspective, a very fascinating debate. I'm going to use terms that may sound a bit technical, but it's what's called local and global perception. And what local perception means is the fact that you might pick up a single source of information, which might be, for instance, the orientation of the hand at ball release, for instance. Whereas global information is spread across the whole of the body. And what the research evidence suggests actually is that novices are more likely to use a single source of information, to use a local perception strategy. Hence, possibly why they're more likely to be conned or tricked through deception and disguise, because that's the cue they use, and if someone does something different, then they find it hard to pick up. Whereas experts are more likely to use information distributed across the body, this global perception notion. And maybe that's why actually these techniques of actually degrading vision by making it fuzzy actually doesn't hinder expert performance very much, because they're not picking up one cue in fine detail, but rather they're picking up information that's distributed across the system.
Mm-hmm.
And then the second point I was going to make regards to this funneling approach, of course, is that vision really has two roles here. Firstly, you have to select what action or swing to perform, and that requires a minimum of 200 milliseconds. So really, you have to make that decision quite early in ball flight.
Mm-hmm.
But there is some evidence to suggest that we can use vision to fine-tune a movement a little bit more quickly, maybe up to around 70 milliseconds. But even then, I guess, I don't know how far the ball is when it's 70 milliseconds from the batter, but really you cannot use vision after that 70 milliseconds period. There just isn't the time for that information to be processed by the brain.
Mm-hmm.
So I think those differentiation between local and global,
absolutely,
prior to ball release, and then using vision to change an action and using vision to fine-tune an action is probably worth highlighting those differentiations, really.
Yeah, absolutely. I couldn't agree more. And that kind of illustrates for me a discussion I had with one of our professional players who's just started doing our customized training with uHIT, where we gradually manipulate different aspects of the pitches, the speeds of the pitches, the types of pitches based on what their assessment tells us. And everyone who registers for our uHIT Academy seminars gets an opportunity to take one of these assessments free of charge. And as he's gone from his assessment to doing his customized training, we've been in touch. We have kind of like weekly lessons almost, that we've been doing, like hitting lessons, but hitting lessons in ways that, have never been done before, because this is a digital tool and we're meeting digitally like this on Zoom, where it's like just checking in. How's it going? What are you seeing? What's the experience like? Kind of like the interviews that Tim did here, like with Joey Votto and with others. And what we're trying to do as coaches, so to speak, us and me and other uHIT specialists, is hear from them firsthand in their language what they're seeing or not seeing, and then how we can fine-tune what we do with the customized training a little bit more, fine-tune the algorithm so that it is systematically targeting the issues that they're telling us. And this one player told me, as I was working with him, that he was noticing that he was kind of like filtering out all the other stuff about the wind-up and release, right? The wind-up and release became a lot less important to him than the actual ball flight. And he noticed that he was focusing on that particular variable. And to the point we were talking about before, like, when can you start anticipating with uHIT? It's very, it's like I said, it's the best pitcher in terms of disguising his mechanics from pitch to pitch that you will ever see. And so what this player did was he realized, I can't look at this guy's leg kick. I can't look at this guy's arm slot to get an idea of what I need to do to predict the pitch. I need to focus on that initial ball flight. And so through this process, this iterative process that uHIT's customized training did, he was able to figure out what the key to his success would be. And there are many, this is one success story. I can tell you of hundreds of unsuccessful stories in this capacity, because a player who's maybe at a more novice level will do exactly what you're talking about. They'll only have one thing they look for: the angle of the hand, right? The spin of the ball, the leg kick, whatever it is. And then if they don't see that clue, then they can get frustrated because they're not able to perform at the level they're used to performing. And we've had this numerous times, like when we start with a college team, when we start with even some professional players, they'll say, oh, I don't see this, or I don't see that, or I don't see the spin, or I don't see the leg kick. And those are all the things that they're specifically used as their clues, right? But they're not necessarily, like you said, engaging on that expert level really yet of how to look at all of the cues that they can get, right? And all of those cues, kind of what our research, when we were trying to research what parts of the brain are involved in hitting a baseball, we figured, you know what, let's boil it all down to that ball flight, because at the end of the day, the leg kick, what the catcher does, the spin of the ball, all that is giving you is preliminary information about the ball flight. And so it's interesting hearing it from this perspective about all the other variables that an expert will pull on to get a little bit more anticipatory capability. And that's something that, you know, you're able to do in some degree with a digital tool like uHIT, and you're not able to do in other capacities, at least in a cost-effective way with a tool like uHIT. I want to pivot to a couple of the questions because we've got a pretty engaged audience here, it seems. This first one is from Kevin. He asked, what degree of this is innate versus learned? At least at the top level, how important is better eyesight? Can you talk about that a little bit, Mark?
Yeah, I mean, it's nearly, they're all learned skills ultimately. And coming back to the vision thing, I mean, there are different areas of research here. I mean, firstly, there is work that is done by optometrists, opticians, vision scientists, which usually the science is not particularly strong. And of course, there are ulterior motives to be able to highlight the importance of vision. But essentially, you know, the work that's been done that has looked at expert v novice differences in visual function has not consistently reported differences. Whereas the differences in regards to the perceptual cognitive side of things, this knowledge of context, this ability to pick up postural cues, it has been consistently demonstrated across at least a couple of hundred independent research studies. Mm-hmm. And clearly these skills develop through prolonged exposure to the sport. You know, these elite players in some instances obviously can accumulate 10 years, 10,000 hours of practice in the sport. So these lead to the development of these perceptual cognitive knowledge structures that allow experts to see things differently to the way that we see. So in other words, their eyesight is no better than ours. It's just that they see the world in a different way. I guess interrelated to the question is this notion of whether there is some genetic markers or predictors in regards to how people adapt to engagement in practice over a prolonged period of time. It's possible. I mean, there's no real strong empirical evidence on that, but it's I wouldn't dismiss the fact that you know, if two people are exposed to the same amount and quality of practice, that those two people possibly might not respond in the same way, which suggests that there may be some genetic predispositions to this factor. But you know, but clearly no one gets out of bed one morning and becomes a great baseball batter if they've never had that exposure to the sport before. That's unlikely.
Yeah, absolutely. No, it's a learned skill. I think, you know, specifically to Kevin's question, there's no either or really. But like you said, no one is born one day knowing how to hit a curveball. That is something that's learned. There are components, like we said, there are components to developing that expertise that we call hitting a curveball, right? That involve things like this perceptual cognitive ability of anticipation. But there's also some aspects of just regular old optometry type visual acuity or eyesight. There's a quote here in the section about Votto from David Whiteside from the New York Yankees. He's the director of sports performance science. And, you know, he talks about how let me get the quote exactly right. He says there was a historical misconception that visual acuity, meaning like just regular old eyesight, when you go to the eye doctor and you read the letters, that visual acuity reigns supreme in baseball. He said that was a historical misconception. But more specifically, it says evidence is coming to light that in interceptive sports, meaning like baseball, where you have to intercept a pitch, volleyball, where you have to intercept a volley, right, a serve, or tennis, etc. That in interceptive sports, there's beginning to be a shift in the focus to the predictive component of striking a moving object. So anticipation, prediction. And he talks about that the head and eye kinematics, meaning how the head and the eye moves, comprise a cue detection or advanced cue detection, and the ability for those pieces of biology, of your physiology, to do dynamic object tracking. In other words, moving object or moving baseball or moving softball or moving volleyball tracking, as well as contextual elements of anticipation, meaning did the catcher move to this side of the plate? Did the pitcher raise his knee on his leg kick just a little bit higher for the fastball than he did for the curveball? And David from the Yankees, David Whiteside, talks about this as the next arms race in MLB. In other words, how to develop hitters. This is going to be what, in his view, the next arms race, kind of like what we've seen in literally the arm race for pitchers in Major League Baseball, with everything that Driveline has done to really, pick apart how velocity is generated and to really break down the biomechanics in such a way that has put hitters at a disadvantage from the arms race on the pitcher's side. David sounds like is seeing this as the arms race really on the hitter's side, which is very interesting. It kind of gets to these points like touched on by Kevin's question about what degree of this is innate and what degree of this is learned. If it is learnable, that means that it's something you can do as a major league team or as a travel ball coach. Glad that, thanks, Kevin. I see your comment in the chat here, so I'm glad we're able to answer that. We do have another question in the chat, but I'm going to pivot to give a chance to one of the participants who wrote in a question ahead of time. Now we give everybody who registers a chance to send us their questions ahead of time so that we can ask our guests that. So we did have a question from Japan. We had another one from Virginia, and one from Washington State. It seems like the one from Japan, as I'm reading it now, is pretty much this topic of learned versus innate. So it looks like people are on the same page about that in Japan or in the United States. But this is from a softball parent, Kelly is her name, in Washington State. And she asked, and I think this is something that's more important for the youth, the younger players that uHIT has worked with. I know we have some younger player coaches on the call. For instance, Andrew in high school in Indiana, Coach Eisfelder is on right now. And they have the situation where Coach Kelly is talking about the situation where you have a daughter, let's say, if she's a softball parent, the daughter plays other sports, right, out of season from softball. So her question is, are there benefits for sports vision, but we can use that more broadly here for anticipation skills and other things. Are there benefits for sports vision from playing other sports out of season from softball? So can you elaborate on that, Mark? I mean, I know it's a broad question, but are there benefits really to playing other sports that can cross over?
Well, I guess the fundamental question really relates to the speciality or the specificity of expertise. And, the empirical evidence is actually very strong. And that is that expertise is very specific to the domain of prolonged engagement in practice. Now, of course, the question is, well, are there some skills that might transfer? Certainly at an intuitive, anecdotal level, you'll hear lots of coaches go, well, he or she is engaged in that sport and there's been some transfer. But empirically, actually, there isn't a great deal of evidence as to what transfers, if anything, would transfer. And then there are interesting follow-up questions, even if there is transfer, of how much engagement do you need in that other sport for transfer to actually take place.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, the rules around transfer is that clearly the more similar two sports are in terms of their perceptual, cognitive, motor components, then the more likely there is to be transfer.
Right.
But by and large, I think that the benefits of transfer are less well developed than we think. I mean, clearly there are some disadvantages with early specialization around burnout and the risk of overuse injuries. And in many ways, kids at a very young age, don't know where their passion and interest lies. And so I'm not necessarily promoting the importance of specialization here. And to some degree, what I would argue is that it's helpful for kids to participate in a wide variety of sports. But
Mm-hmm.
I think what I probably would be a strong component of is I think that the transfer that occurs from one sport to another, I mean, there may be transfer from baseball to softball, for instance, possibly. Okay, but the possibility of there being transfer from American football or basketball to baseball is pretty small, I would have thought. Certainly on the perceptual cognitive components of
Right. On the perceptual cognitive component, I think is an
yeah.
important, distinction there because, I have people from the 80s or the early 90s will remember Bo Jackson, being a professional baseball player and being a professional football player. Later in the 90s, Deion Sanders, who recently came back in a commercial for something I saw recently. But he was, a professional baseball and professional football player too. In those particular areas, there was some level of, with Bo and Deion, let's say, there was some level of perceptual cognitive, overlap that they could transfer between the two sports. But it was in their particular instances, I think it's probably safe to say that their physical capabilities were the biggest drivers of their participation in both of those sports. Bo being, incredible base stealer, and then Deion in the case of doing receiving balls on on kickoffs and things like that. So,
yeah, I mean, I would probably add that there is probably more evidence around the fact that some of the psychological skills might be transferable, for instance.
Yeah.
But certainly around technical and tactical skills, the evidence is not high. And in many instances, actually, where people become successful in two sports, which has progressively decreased over the last 50 years because of increasing professionalization and earlier engagement in prolonged training. It is often the case that people just specialize in two sports simultaneously. We've got some data to suggest that people who reach the elite level in two sports spend the same amount of hours in practice as the people who achieve expertise in each sport independently. So there's no evidence to suggest that you can circumvent the amount of hours needed to reach the elite level by engaging in another sport.
Right. Yeah, I know. I think, I grew up in Chicago in the 90s. So, Michael Jordan, basketball, and then, the Netflix series that was out earlier this spring, The Last Dance, that covered the Bulls, successes in the 90s and then the break where Michael Jordan retired and then decided to play baseball. It was a feat really that he was able to get to AA and hit a little bit in AA. But, this is the identified as one of the, best athletes in the world. But he was having trouble hitting a baseball at AA. And, so, it's like you said, those skills that can transfer. There's obviously the psychological skills that can transfer. And in Jordan's case, he was out there getting as many reps as he could to the point that, he was, getting blisters on his hands because he's taking so many swings. But those kind of skill transfers, I think this dovetails well with a question that has been put in the chat here by Harold. He asked about Barry Bonds. And, whenever I think of Barry Bonds, I think of what you mentioned, Mark, just now about skills transferring between similar sports potentially, right? But in the case of Barry Bonds, a couple of other players, even like Albert Pujols, very, very accomplished hitters in Major League Baseball, really some of the best baseball hitters in the world. There's a famous story about them facing off against the softball pitcher, Jenny Finch, and reputedly, Barry Bonds was not able to touch her. And the ball is bigger, right? So he has that advantage going for him. Of course, she's a little bit closer, but when you balance out the speed of the pitch, it's about the same amount of time in terms of ball flight that he has to decide. And yet, with a bigger ball, he couldn't do it. Albert Pujols, I'm told, was able to get a little foul tipped. So he was able to adapt just a little bit, but still not really. And, that kind of skill transfer, obviously that's an experiment showing where, your skill development in baseball does not just automatically transfer to another interceptive sport like softball. And why is that? Well, there's a ton of cues that, the batter has to pick up on, right? The wind up of the release, the actual, types of pitches from an underhand release in softball that are different than the overhand release in baseball. That's a huge anticipation problem to be thrown into without having that kind of background. Harold's question here is specifically about Bonds' career towards the end, where he was leading the league in walks because of his selectivity of pitches. He also led the league in slugging percentage, Harold says here. And so he's asking really about, it's maybe kind of a tough question for you, Mark, but I'll let you take a stab at it. He says, how can uHIT and Mark's book, I'll say, add to having a hitting plan, sticking to that plan, and then doing the traditional, physical trainings all together? Because it sounds like from Harold's question that there's a question about, as a coach, as a player, as a parent coach, I should say, how do you make a hitting plan or any kind of, let's call it anticipation sport plan, stick to that plan, right? So that might get to the psychological characteristics, the psychological things to prioritize, and then integrate that with the physical side. Because, at the end of the day, there is a bat being swung, there is, a base that has to be run to. So there is a physical side to all this, which we're focused on the cognitive side, as uHIT. But, I know that in baseball and in softball, it's very tempting, and many people focus all of their attention on the physical side. What does my swing look like? How strong am I, et cetera? And they'll shortchange the anticipatory aspects, the cognitive aspects. But, we're not agnostic to the physical side. We know that has to exist with the hitting plan, and then the execution and sticking with that hitting plan. So could you comment on that, Mark, and from the perspective for a parent coach, like where would they seek counsel in your book necessarily about maybe the making a plan and sticking to it part, kind of those psychological skills, and then also formulating that plan itself with like what tools should they use or look for, what characteristics should they look for in those tools in order to have a tool that will help them anticipate better on the field?
Yeah, I guess there's at least a couple of issues there. One is around the role of sports psychology in developing pre-shot routines, for instance. And there's some nice sections in the book from, if I get this right, Anna Sorensen, the golfer, about how the fact she's worked extensively with the sports psychologist. And she has a consistent pre-shot routine, which I think takes 20 odd seconds every single shot. And even in essence, also, she's got some very interesting things as well, in the sense of if things don't go right, how she can very easily throw away the mistake and focus on the now. So that it's always about the next shot, this shot, as opposed to previous shot. So there's a lot of interesting work in the book around that. But I think also the theme throughout the book, actually, and in terms of a lot of my speaking, is about this importance of specificity again. Now, I know Epstein wrote a book called Range, but to be honest, having read the book, it's obviously very well written, but he's very liberal with the science, to be honest.
Which book are you talking about right now?
Range, Epstein's book, Range.
Oh, Range. Okay.
Yeah,
David Epstein? Is that David Epstein from the sports sheet?
David Epstein, yeah, where the subtitle is Why Generalists Triumph in a Specialist World. Now, I think in sport, I'd retitle it Specificity, Why Specialists Triumph in a Generalized World. And I think the concept of specificity actually goes very much also into the notion of training. And, in many ways, what we should try and do is recreate the performance demands as best as possible. So by way of illustration, we know that when we're anxious or when we mentally or physically fatigue, we process information very differently to when we're not anxious. So in other words, we change our gaze behaviors. We rely on different sources of information. So I guess to some degree, actually, there is a line of argument here that suggests that if you practice these skills without the same kinds of demands that you get during competition, and obviously in competition, you have to combine the perception, the decision making, and the action. And clearly, you never perceive a pitch in isolation from the context of the game. And clearly, yes, there will be anxiety. Yes, there will be issues around emotional control. Yes, you might be fatigued, certainly towards the end of a game. And there are different sources of stress. So the best way to prepare players for those environments is to create realistic practice sessions. And of course, the more live matches that players engage in, then the better they will become at finding ways to adapt and to develop those kinds of key components and skills.
Yeah, I'll just relate to it briefly in your book. The topic of talking about kids not having like helicopter parents around, which I thought was a very relevant topic for definitely for the youth athletes that we've worked with, and their parents knowing like when they're doing too much and when they are doing too little. And and that's an important topic. We might have to, it's funny, as I started looking at how elite athletes are made, I realized we are severely underserving this book by only doing one seminar on it. We could probably do 3 seminars on it. And I think this was a good kind of like overview as we're coming up on about 1 hour now. We might need to start bringing it to a close, but that was a topic that I think relates here in terms of like how athletes' parents are involved in their training. I want to remind everyone that you will get with the purchase of How Elite Athletes Are Made, you will get a free month of our customized training on uHIT. So I'm going to put that in the chat right now. There's a link there for you to get uHIT's customized training for baseball through the baseball app. That's in the chat right now, and I'm putting in the chat also the link to get the softball training as well. Customized training for 1 month, off $32 for that first month, because we do the left-handed pitcher, right-handed pitcher, and pitch recognition. We do the left-handed and right-handed pitcher in zone recognition. So each of those are $8 on their own. Altogether $32, and with that you get uHIT Plus, which allows you to navigate to other aspects of how we fine-tune your anticipation skills in uHIT. You get that free for getting a customized training. So again, the book is The Best How Elite Athletes Are Made. It's from my brief survey of it, it's been really a great read, and I'm looking forward to getting into it a little bit more now. I'm just going to throw in one more question that was sent to us ahead of time. This is being recorded. We will have this on our YouTube channel, and this is for everyone else who does watch our uHIT Academies. Maybe you couldn't make it today. You can always see it on, or tell people that missed it, that they can always see it on our YouTube channel. in the coming weeks. But we always, we do our best to get to your questions when you email us those questions. I want to ask this question to you, Mark, because obviously you don't know much about uHIT other than kind of what we've talked about here and some of the background research that I had done with Jordan, the other founder of DeServo and the maker of uHIT. But this is a question that comes up for us regularly. And I'm curious about your perspective on it. I think we've kind of touched on it a little bit, but this is from a baseball parent coach in Virginia. Mike is his name. He's got a I think a 15-year-old son, 14 or 15-year-old son. And before they started doing customized training for uHIT, he asked me a question that I've continually thought about as this issue about how do we explain how are you teaching anticipation skills with uHIT? And he put it, I think, very succinctly. He said, how can doing hitting work with your eyes on a phone help when the bat is in your hand and when it's all about putting bat to ball, as he put it? So can you, from your perspective, Mark, I mean, I've talked about this many ways from my angle, but like from your perspective, would you see any benefit at all? And, you can say, frankly, what you think. Is there any possible way that the visual anticipation skills of seeing a trajectory and predicting where it's going to go, does that matter necessarily, whether it's on the phone or whether you are bat in hand? And what are the aspects of that, simulation that would have to be in place in order for it to make sense or make a skill transfer to when the bat is in hand and you're putting bat to ball? Can you talk about it from your perspective?
Yeah, sure. I mean, as I said at the start, I mean, there are different perceptual cognitive skills that are involved in the process of striking a ball, whether it's cricket, tennis, or baseball. And clearly, the more higher level these cognitive skills are, then probably the more amenable they become to video or VR-based simulation training, for instance.
Mm-hmm.
So, for instance, being able to read the game in regards to expectational information about stage of the game, field placements, tendencies of the pitcher, and then coming down from that, the ability to pick up these postural cues are all sort of high to moderate level cognitive skills. And I think that they would certainly be amenable to the type of training that you're talking about. So I guess, and again, this came up in the earlier point when I spoke about the different roles of vision. I mean, if you don't have a physical action, then I guess you're not actually training ball to bat contact. But that is one component of the action.
Right.
And I do feel that you can train some of those higher cognitive factors that obviously play a key role in it without actually having to swing a bat.
Yeah, absolutely.
And I suppose as a second point, whilst to some degree, what's better than virtual reality? Well, I guess reality. And that is true. That is true to some degree.
Right.
But I guess the advantage that you have with VR and video and the use of iPhones and stuff is the fact that you can control the stimulus better.
Right.
And you can allow the athlete to see, a lot of pictures, a lot of different deliveries. Whereas I guess it would take you a long time to expose the player to the same amount of experience through actual match play in real world situations.
Right. Yeah. I think for our future, our part 2 on how elite athletes are made, I would pick up on that, on the topic of where you guys describe the city size as being important for where elite athletes come from. Just to tease everybody for a future session on that, apparently the best athletes come from more mid-sized cities in terms of like 30,000, maybe 100,000. population towns or cities versus like, millions, like a city like Chicago or like New York. Anyhow, we'll kind of leave it there, but I want to thank everybody for coming on. This has been a very interesting, Sunday morning on the West Coast, Sunday afternoon on the East Coast, and everywhere else in between, and other places in the world where people are logged on right now. We covered a broad range of topics. This will be on our YouTube channel in the future, and we haven't yet announced our February uHIT Academy seminar yet, but we will be doing that shortly. We do have another parent-player focused uHIT Academy seminar coming up. That may be in February, it may be in March, and we do have a couple of other places, a couple of other topics, where we're looking at getting a topic